Why did the numbers blindside us? Malcolm Pierce, my director, yelled, his voice cutting through the usual afternoon calm of Blue Ocean Industries. 5 days ago, this same man had dismissed me from the quarterly review with a wave of his hand and those cutting words, "We need someone more polished." 3 months earlier, I'd been promoted to senior financial analyst at Blue Ocean Industries, a mid-sized manufacturing company that prided itself on stability and growth. I was thrilled. After years of grinding through spreadsheets and proving myself in smaller roles, I finally had a seat at the table where decisions were made. My cubicle was replaced with a corner office, complete with a view of the city skyline and a nameplate that read Alina Sanders in bold letters. The promotion hadn't come easily. I'd spent 3 years as a junior analyst, often staying late to catch errors others missed, volunteering for the projects nobody else wanted. My predecessor, an older gentleman named Frank who'd been with the company for 27 years, had specifically recommended me for the position before his retirement. "Alina sees things others don't," he told Pierce during our transition meeting. "She's got instincts for this work that can't be taught." Those words meant everything to me. Frank had mentored me through my early years, teaching me to look beyond surface-level data to find the stories hidden in spreadsheets. He showed me how to spot patterns that indicated trouble brewing, how to read between the lines of financial reports. Most importantly, he taught me that being right wasn't enough. You had to be able to communicate your findings clearly and stand behind them when others disagreed. The quarterly review process was my first major responsibility. For weeks, I'd been diving deep into the numbers, cross-referencing data points, analyzing trends that others might miss. The company's financial health wasn't as rosy as the executive summary suggested. Revenue was declining in key sectors, expenses were climbing faster than projected, and several major clients were showing signs of pulling back their orders. My office became a war room of sorts. Charts covered every available wall space, color-coded to track different expense categories and revenue streams. I had 3 monitors running constantly, displaying real-time data feeds from our overseas operations, domestic suppliers, and client accounts. My assistant, Miranda, started bringing me lunch at my desk because I rarely left the office during those intensive analysis weeks. "You're going to burn yourself out," she warned one afternoon, setting down a sandwich I'd forgotten I'd requested. "I can't afford to miss anything," I replied, highlighting another discrepancy in the supply chain costs. "This is my first major presentation to the board. It has to be perfect." Perfect. That word would come back to haunt me in ways I couldn't have imagined. I remember the exact moment I discovered the real problem. It was a Tuesday evening, long after most of my colleagues had gone home. The cleaning crew was making their rounds, and I sat hunched over my computer, surrounded by printed reports and empty coffee cups. That's when I found the discrepancy in the overseas manufacturing costs. A pattern emerged from the chaos of numbers. Costs were spiraling out of control, but someone had been massaging the figures to make them appear manageable. The discovery sent adrenaline coursing through my veins. This wasn't just a spreadsheet error or a one-time miscalculation. Someone in the overseas operations team had been systematically underreporting expenses for at least 6 months. The pattern was subtle but unmistakable once you knew what to look for: small adjustments here and there, always in the company's favor, always just below the threshold that would trigger automatic review flags. I spent the rest of that night tracing the irregularities back to their source. The trail led to our primary manufacturing facility in Southeast Asia, where our operations manager, William Cross, had been filing monthly reports that consistently showed costs running below budget. But when I cross-referenced those reports with actual invoice data from suppliers, shipping companies, and local labor contracts, the numbers told a completely different story. My heart raced as I traced the inconsistencies. This wasn't just a minor accounting error. This was a systematic problem that would hit us hard when the quarterly numbers went public. We were looking at a potential disaster, and I was the only one who seemed to see it coming. But there was more. As I dug deeper into Cross's reports, I discovered he'd been using creative accounting methods to hide mounting problems with quality control at the overseas facility. Defect rates were climbing, leading to increased production costs and customer complaints, but those expenses were being buried in various budget categories to avoid triggering performance reviews. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Pierce. His office was impressive: mahogany desk, leather chairs, awards lining the walls. He barely looked up when I entered, his attention focused on his phone screen. I later learned he'd been texting his golf partners about their weekend plans. "What can I do for you, Sanders?" he asked, still scrolling. I placed my analysis on his desk, the pages meticulously organized with color-coded charts and highlighted problem areas. The document was 47 pages long, complete with supporting documentation and recommended corrective actions. "We have a serious issue with our overseas manufacturing costs. The numbers being reported don't match the actual expenses, and if we don't address this immediately, our quarterly review is going to show significant losses." He glanced at the first page, then pushed the papers aside without reading further. "These projections look fine to me. You might be overthinking this. Sir, I've triple-checked these calculations. We're looking at a 20% cost overrun that hasn't been properly reported. This will absolutely impact our quarterly performance, and it suggests potential fraud or gross incompetence in our overseas operations." The word fraud got his attention briefly, but not in the way I'd hoped. Pierce's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation, Sanders. Do you have definitive proof of intentional wrongdoing?" "I have clear evidence of systematic misrepresentation of costs," I replied carefully. "Whether it's intentional fraud or negligent reporting practices, the impact on our financials is the same." Pierce finally looked up, his expression dismissive. "Sanders, I appreciate your thoroughness, but I've been doing this for 15 years. Sometimes new analysts see problems where there aren't any. Cross has been managing overseas operations for 8 years without major issues. Let's not create panic over minor fluctuations." The dismissal stung, but I pressed on. "This isn't a minor fluctuation. The pattern suggests systematic underreporting of costs. If we present these numbers to the board without addressing the underlying issues, that's enough." His voice was sharp, final. "I'll handle the quarterly review. Focus on your regular reports." Walking out of his office, I felt a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Had I made a mistake? I spent the rest of the week double-checking my work, running additional analyses, seeking second opinions from trusted colleagues in other departments. One of those colleagues was Dr. Catherine Zhou, our head of quality assurance. When I showed her the patterns I'd identified, her face grew grim. "I've been tracking similar inconsistencies from the production side," she admitted. "Cross has been reporting defect rates that don't match what we're seeing in customer complaints and return rates. I tried to raise this with Pierce last month, but he said customer complaints were a marketing issue, not a manufacturing problem." Another colleague, Alex Thompson from IT, provided additional confirmation. "Cross has been requesting unusual database access permissions over the past few months," he told me confidentially. "He's been able to modify cost entries in ways that normally require dual approval." I flagged it as a potential security issue, but Pierce approved the access extension. Every check confirmed my initial findings. We were heading for trouble, and the evidence suggested it went beyond simple accounting errors into potential misconduct territory. The quarterly review meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. I assumed I'd be presenting my findings, walking the executive team through the data I'd so carefully prepared. Sunday night, I practiced my presentation, rehearsing the key points, anticipating questions about the cost overruns and potential solutions. I even prepared backup slides addressing the overseas operations issues and recommended personnel actions. Miranda had helped me organize all the supporting documentation into neat binders for each board member. "You're going to knock them dead," she said encouragingly as we finished the preparation work. "This is the most comprehensive analysis I've ever seen." Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp energy that usually made me feel optimistic about the week ahead. I dressed carefully, my best blazer, conservative heels, hair pulled back in what I hoped was a professional style. I gathered my materials and headed to the conference room 15 minutes early, wanting to test the presentation equipment and arrange the handout materials properly. That's when Pierce intercepted me in the hallway. "Sanders, there's been a change of plans," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We're restructuring the presentation team for today's review." "Restructuring?" I felt confusion wash over me. "What does that mean?" "We've decided to go with a different approach. Bradley from marketing will be handling the financial overview, and Janet from operations will cover the cost analysis." My stomach dropped. Bradley Wellington was Pierce's nephew, recently hired as a marketing coordinator despite having no financial analysis background. Janet Murphy from operations was competent but had no knowledge of my specific findings about the overseas irregularities. "But this is my analysis." I've been working on this for months. I know these numbers better than anyone. Pierce's expression hardened. We need someone more polished for this presentation. The board expects a certain level of refinement in how information is delivered. The words hit me like a physical blow. More polished. The implication was clear. I wasn't sophisticated enough, wasn't executive material, wasn't the kind of person who belonged in that boardroom. The fact that Bradley, with his Ivy League pedigree and family connections, would be presenting my work to the board felt like salt in an already painful wound. I don't understand, I managed. My work has always been thorough and accurate. My presentations have received positive feedback from department heads and client managers. This isn't about your work quality, Sanders. It's about presentation skills, executive presence. Bradley and Janet have more experience with board-level communications. Bradley's experience consisted of 3 PowerPoint presentations to the marketing team about social media strategy. Janet's board experience was limited to a single quarterly update about facilities maintenance. Meanwhile, I had detailed knowledge of a potentially company-threatening financial issue that neither of them understood. I wanted to argue, to point out that neither Bradley nor Janet had spent weeks analyzing these specific numbers, that they didn't understand the nuances of what we were facing. But something in Pierce's tone told me the decision was final. Will I at least be in the room? In case there are questions about the data? That won't be necessary. Bradley and Janet can handle any questions that come up. The dismissal was complete. Not only was I being excluded from presenting my own work, but I wasn't even allowed to observe and provide support if complex questions arose. I watched through the glass conference room walls as my colleagues presented my analysis to the board. Bradley stumbled through the cost breakdowns, clearly unfamiliar with the specific details. When board member Mrs. Hendricks asked about the methodology behind the overseas cost projections, Bradley gave a vague response about standard industry practices that completely missed the point of my analysis. Janet did better with the operational overview, but when questions came up about the specific irregularities I'd identified in Cross's reports, she dismissed them as minor variances within acceptable parameters. The board members nodded and asked perfunctory questions, seemingly satisfied with the superficial overview. But I knew better. I knew what those numbers really meant, and I could see from the board's questions that they sensed something was missing from the presentation. Mrs. Hendricks, in particular, looked skeptical when Janet glossed over the overseas manufacturing costs. After the presentation ended, I overheard board chair Harold Fitzgerald expressing concern to Pierce about some of the financial projections. The overseas numbers seem optimistic, he said. Are we confident in those cost controls? Pierce assured him that everything was under control, that the analysis had been thorough and the projections were conservative. I wanted to scream. The projections weren't conservative, they were based on falsified data that I'd specifically identified and documented. The days following the review were tense. Pierce seemed pleased with how the presentation had gone, praising Bradley and Janet for their professional delivery. He even sent a company-wide email highlighting their exceptional work on the quarterly analysis. My name wasn't mentioned anywhere in the communication. Meanwhile, I returned to my regular duties, feeling like a spectator in my own professional life. But I didn't stop monitoring the numbers. If anything, my exclusion from the board presentation made me more determined to track the developing situation. And the situation was developing rapidly. Then the overseas reports started coming in. Tuesday brought the first wave of concerning data. Manufacturing costs for the previous month were significantly higher than projected, exactly as my analysis had predicted. Cross submitted another report showing everything was within normal parameters, but I could see from the supplier invoices that costs were spiraling upward. Wednesday brought news that 2 major clients were reducing their orders. Fitzgerald Industries, our second largest customer, sent a formal complaint about quality issues with recent shipments. Another client, Meridian Corp., wait, I couldn't use that name. Another client, Coastal Manufacturing, reported similar problems and requested immediate corrective action. Thursday revealed that the currency fluctuations we'd been tracking were having a more severe impact than initially calculated. The dollar had strengthened against the local currencies in our manufacturing regions, making our cost overruns even more expensive when converted to our reporting currency. By Friday, even Pierce couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. I watched from my office as he took increasingly urgent phone calls from clients, suppliers, and board members. His usual confident demeanor was cracking under the pressure of questions he couldn't answer. That afternoon, Mrs. Hendricks called an emergency board meeting for the following Monday. The agenda was simple: review the actual quarterly performance against projected figures and address any discrepancies. I watched Pierce's confidence begin to crack as each day brought fresh evidence of the problems I'd identified weeks earlier. His morning meetings grew longer and more intense. His usually composed demeanor showed signs of strain. He started staying later at the office, something he rarely did during normal circumstances. Friday afternoon, I was updating some routine reports when I heard raised voices from the executive wing. Pierce was on a conference call with the board, and even through his closed office door, his agitation was obvious. I could hear fragments of the conversation: unexpected variances, client complaints, cost overruns. Miranda stopped by my desk before leaving for the weekend. "Mr. Pierce asked me to pull all the overseas manufacturing files for the past 6 months," she said quietly. "He also requested copies of your original analysis, the one from 3 weeks ago." That weekend, I found myself torn between vindication and genuine concern for the company. I'd been right about the numbers, but being right didn't feel as satisfying as I'd imagined it would. Blue Ocean Industries was in trouble, and despite how I'd been treated, I didn't want to see the company fail. Too many good people worked here, people who didn't deserve to lose their jobs because of management's poor decisions. I spent Saturday morning reviewing my original analysis, updating it with the new data that had come in over the past few weeks. The situation was worse than I'd initially projected. The overseas cost overruns were accelerating, client complaints were mounting, and Cross was still filing reports that bore no resemblance to reality. Sunday evening, I received an unexpected phone call from Dr. Zhou. "Alina, I just got word that there's going to be a major announcement Monday morning about overseas operations. I think Cross is being terminated." The news didn't surprise me, but it raised new concerns. What about the board meeting? Are they going to address the financial irregularities? I don't know, but Pierce has been calling people all weekend. He's in damage control mode. Monday morning brought the reckoning. I arrived at the office to find an atmosphere of barely controlled panic. Pierce was already in, which was unusual for a man who typically strolled in around 9:30. His office lights had been on since before sunrise, and through his glass walls, I could see him surrounded by papers and laptop screens. The quarterly numbers had come in over the weekend. The results were exactly what I'd predicted, worse, actually, because the problems had been allowed to compound while everyone focused on polish rather than substance. The company had lost nearly $2.3 million in the quarter, with the majority of losses traced directly to the overseas manufacturing issues I'd identified in my original analysis. At 8:30 a.m., Pierce called an emergency all-staff meeting. The conference room was packed as he announced that William Cross had been terminated for financial irregularities and failure to meet reporting standards. He also announced that the board would be conducting a comprehensive review of all overseas operations and financial reporting procedures. But the announcement that really caught my attention was his final statement: "We will be implementing new financial oversight procedures to prevent similar issues in the future. These procedures will include enhanced analytical review processes and direct board reporting for all major financial concerns." Translation: someone was going to be held accountable for missing the warning signs that I'd identified weeks earlier. That's when it happened. The moment that made all the previous frustration worth enduring. Pierce burst out of his office after the staff meeting, his usual composed facade completely abandoned. His tie was loosened, his hair disheveled, and his face carried the look of a man who'd just realized he was in over his head. "Why did the numbers blindside us?" he shouted to the office at large, his voice carrying across the entire floor. "How did we miss this? These costs should have been flagged weeks ago." I looked up from my computer, meeting his eyes across the office space. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken acknowledgement of what had transpired. Around us, the office had gone quiet, with everyone sensing the tension of the moment. "Sanders," he called out, his voice now urgent rather than dismissive. "I need to see you in my office. Now." Walking across that office floor felt like the longest journey of my professional life. My colleagues watched with curiosity and concern as I made my way to Pierce's door. Some of them knew about my earlier analysis, others were just beginning to piece together what had happened. Dr. Zhou gave me an encouraging nod as I passed her desk. Miranda whispered, "You've got this," as I walked by. Even Alex Thompson from IT looked up from his computer with an expression that seemed to say, "Finally." Pierce's office, which had seemed so intimidating weeks earlier, now felt like the scene of a desperate last stand. Papers were scattered across every surface, and multiple laptop screens displayed various financial reports and projections. The awards on his wall seemed to mock the current crisis. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "I need you to walk me through your analysis from 3 weeks ago. Every detail." I took a breath, centering myself before responding. "The analysis I tried to present before the quarterly review?" "Yes. That analysis." His admission was grudging, but it was there. I opened my laptop and pulled up the files I'd prepared weeks earlier. The overseas manufacturing costs were the primary concern. The reported figures didn't align with the actual expenses being incurred. Currency fluctuations were having a more significant impact than the standard hedging strategies were accounting for. Pierce leaned forward, his attention completely focused on my screen. "Show me the specific numbers." For the next 2 hours, I walked him through everything I'd discovered. The patterns in the cost overruns, the client reduction signals, the supply chain vulnerabilities. All the issues I tried to raise before the quarterly review were now undeniably relevant. But I also showed him the additional analysis I'd conducted over the past 3 weeks. The situation had deteriorated exactly as I'd predicted, with cascading effects across multiple business areas. Client complaints had increased by 340%, defect rates were up 67%, and the cost overruns were accelerating at an alarming pace. "How did you catch this when everyone else missed it?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "I spent time with the raw data instead of relying on the summary reports. I cross-referenced multiple data sources and looked for patterns that might indicate systematic issues rather than random fluctuations. Most importantly, I didn't accept Cross's reports at face value. I verified them against independent sources." He rubbed his forehead, the weight of the situation clearly pressing on him. "What do we do now?" That question marked a turning point. For weeks, I'd been treated as someone whose input wasn't valuable enough for the boardroom. Now, suddenly, I was being asked for solutions to the very problems I'd identified. "We need to implement immediate cost controls on the overseas operations," I began, my confidence returning as I moved into problem-solving mode. "We also need to have honest conversations with our major clients about the pricing adjustments that these cost overruns will require. And we need to revise our quarterly projections to reflect the actual financial position." I paused, then continued with the recommendation I knew would be difficult for him to hear. "Most importantly, we need to be completely transparent with the board about how this situation developed. They need to understand that warning signs were identified and documented weeks before the quarterly review." Pierce's expression grew uncomfortable. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that we present the complete timeline to the board, including my original analysis and the decision to exclude those findings from the quarterly presentation. That would make me look incompetent." "Not addressing it will make you look dishonest," I replied firmly. "The board is going to conduct their own investigation. They'll discover the timeline eventually. Better to control the narrative by being proactive about accountability." Pierce nodded slowly, recognizing the wisdom in my recommendation. "What about the board?" "They're expecting an emergency meeting this afternoon." "Tell them the truth. Explain that the initial quarterly review didn't capture the full scope of the cost issues, and present a comprehensive plan for addressing the problems moving forward." "Will you handle the presentation?" he asked. The question hung in the air between us. 3 weeks ago, he'd deemed me not polished enough for a board presentation. Now he was asking me to save the company's credibility with those same board members. "I can handle it," I said simply. That afternoon, I found myself in the boardroom I'd been excluded from just weeks earlier. The same executives who had listened to Bradley and Janet's superficial presentation now focused intently as I explained the real financial situation facing Blue Ocean Industries. This time, I was prepared for a hostile audience. I knew the board members would be angry about being misled, frustrated about the financial losses, and skeptical about any proposed solutions. But I also knew that my analysis was thorough, my recommendations were sound, and my credibility was backed by the accuracy of my earlier predictions. My presentation was comprehensive but focused. I started with a clear acknowledgement of the current crisis, then provided a detailed timeline showing how the problems had developed and when they had first been identified. I presented the original analysis I'd conducted 3 weeks earlier, demonstrated how subsequent events had confirmed my predictions, and outlined a specific action plan for addressing the ongoing issues. The questions came fast and sharp, but I was ready for them. Every data point, every projection, every recommendation was backed by the weeks of analysis I'd conducted. When Mrs. Hendricks asked why the board hadn't been informed of these concerns earlier, I provided a factual timeline without assigning blame. The analysis was completed 3 weeks before the quarterly review, I explained. Due to concerns about presentation style, the decision was made to exclude these findings from the board presentation. The room fell silent for a moment as the implications sank in. Then Mr. Fitzgerald asked the question everyone was thinking: are you saying this crisis could have been avoided if your analysis had been presented to the board originally? The financial losses couldn't have been completely avoided, as some of the cost overruns were already locked in by contracts and commitments, I replied carefully. However, early intervention could have significantly reduced the impact and prevented the acceleration of problems over the past 3 weeks. The board members exchanged glances as they realized the depth of the problem and the quality of the solution being presented. Mrs. Hendricks asked several detailed questions about my proposed corrective measures, testing my knowledge of implementation timelines and resource requirements. Mr. Fitzgerald pressed me on the realistic expectations for financial recovery. I answered each question thoroughly, drawing on the contingency planning I'd included in my original analysis. When board member Dr. Phillips asked about preventing similar issues in the future, I presented a comprehensive risk management framework that included enhanced reporting procedures, independent verification processes, and direct analytical reporting to board committees. Ms. Sanders, the board chairwoman, said as the presentation concluded, "This is exactly the kind of comprehensive analysis we needed 3 weeks ago. Why wasn't this information included in the original quarterly review?" I glanced at Pierce, who looked uncomfortable but resigned. "The original review focused on different priorities," I said diplomatically. After the board meeting, Pierce and I found ourselves alone in his office once again. The crisis management had been successful, the board had approved my recommended action plan and expressed confidence in the company's ability to recover. But the underlying issues in our working relationship needed to be addressed. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice carrying a humility I'd never heard from him before. "I made a serious mistake in judgment about your capabilities and the value of your analysis." I considered his words carefully before responding. The mistake wasn't about my capabilities. It was about valuing presentation style over analytical substance. He nodded slowly. "You're right. I got caught up in appearances instead of focusing on what really mattered. I let my personal biases cloud my professional judgment. What really matters," I continued, "is having accurate information and making sound decisions based on that information. Everything else is just packaging." "The board has asked me to implement new reporting procedures," Pierce continued. "They want direct analytical reporting for all major financial concerns, with independent verification processes. They've also requested that you be appointed as the lead analyst for all board-level financial presentations." The offer was everything I'd wanted professionally, but it came with the recognition that our working relationship would need to evolve significantly. "I'm willing to take on that responsibility," I said, "but it will require some changes in how we approach financial analysis and reporting." "What kind of changes?" "Complete transparency in data analysis, regardless of whether the findings are comfortable or convenient. Direct communication channels for critical concerns. And most importantly, decisions based on analytical merit rather than presentation preferences or personal relationships." Pierce agreed to all my conditions, and over the following weeks, the dynamic in our department shifted significantly. He began including me in strategic discussions, seeking my input on major financial decisions. My colleagues noticed the change, and several of them approached me privately to acknowledge that my analysis had been instrumental in helping the company navigate the crisis. Dr. Zhou became a close ally, working with me to develop integrated quality and financial monitoring systems. Alex Thompson provided technical support for enhanced data verification processes. Even Miranda remarked on how different the office atmosphere had become. "People actually listen when you talk now," she observed one afternoon. "It's like everyone finally realized what Frank saw in you 3 years ago." The overseas manufacturing issues were gradually brought under control through the implementation of my recommended cost controls and supply chain adjustments. We brought in a new operations manager, Carol Winters, who established transparent reporting procedures and worked closely with my team to ensure financial oversight of all international activities. Client relationships were strengthened through honest communication about pricing adjustments and quality improvements. Most of our major customers appreciated the proactive approach to addressing problems, and several even increased their orders once they saw evidence of improved quality control processes. The company's financial position stabilized over the next quarter, with losses reduced by 73% compared to the crisis period. The board expressed satisfaction with the turnaround and formally commended the new analytical oversight procedures. But perhaps more importantly, I discovered something about myself during this experience. When faced with dismissal and exclusion, I hadn't retreated or become bitter. Instead, I'd maintained my professional standards and continued doing excellent work, even when it wasn't being recognized. The phrase "more polished" had stung initially, but I came to understand that true polish comes from competence, integrity, and the ability to deliver results under pressure. It's not about saying the right things in the right tone, it's about knowing the right things and having the courage to speak up when it matters. 3 months after the crisis, I was promoted to financial director, with expanded responsibilities for strategic planning and risk assessment. The promotion came with a significant salary increase, a larger office, and most importantly, direct reporting authority to the board for all critical financial matters. Pierce remained as my supervisor, but only for a short time. One day, I found him looking through the window with a slumped shoulder after the appraisal meeting. After that, I never saw him again.